So happy New Year and good morning / good afternoon. My name is Michael Goldberg, and I am both a professor teaching entrepreneurship at Weatherhead, and as of about a week ago, I'm the new executive director of the Veale Institute for Entrepreneurship here on campus, and that is a new institute that we've set up that works across our campus to support and accelerate entrepreneurship both here and in the community. So I'm really excited about the role and the chance to interact with many of you. And it's so great for those of you that are here in ThinkBox and for those that are watching on Facebook Live or might watch this later. Our intention for this new Case Western Reserve Entrepreneurship Alumni Speaker Series is to make everything available via streaming. And to see things later, and to also like produce some of these learnings into sort of shorter video clips. So there's a lot of really exciting things that are happening both on our campus and with our alums. So we're hoping that this series can really show and connect with alums that may not necessarily be sitting here in Cleveland. So for those of you on the stream, welcome. I will say, and we'll say it during the stream, and hopefully we'll be able to do this. Please, if you are watching live and you'd like to ask Mike Fisher a question, just post it on the Facebook page, and my colleague Doug DiGirolamo will be monitoring Facebook so we can interject Facebook questions as we go along. And anybody's in the audience, you can just share the stream. You can pick up the stream on the Case Facebook page, but you can share it. So I couldn't ask for a better inaugural guest. It was funny in the kind of world of the small world that is Cleveland and the small world that is entrepreneurship. Mike and I only met a couple years ago, but he's married to a distant cousin of mine, it turns out. I have a lot of cousins, and actually his wife's grandmother and my grandmother were not only sisters, but like best friends and grew up together. So I spent a lot of holidays over the years, and we've gotten to know each other and had some really interesting parallels in our lives, both sort of in our tech. And Mike has also done a number of things on our campus, both with the business school and the School of Engineering. He's a Weatherhead MBA and PhD graduate. And we're really excited to have Sasong, who's a human, help me out here, computer interaction. Sasong is so special, she basically invented her own major. Were you the first person to major in this?
At Case, yes.
At Case.
Other schools offer it.
She's a groundbreaker, and she was part of our San Francisco trek this fall, and recently took a job at a small startup. I think they're called Google, something in the search space. I'm not sure. I still use Alta Vista for the old people in the room. So Sasong, thank you very much for agreeing to moderate. Mike, thank you for being here. Sasong will have some questions. We're going to do something kind of that we'll do with every guest, kind of 5 fast questions, and then we're going to open it up to questions from folks in the audience and then on Facebook, and we'll go from there. So over to you, Sasong.
Awesome. All right, hi everyone. How exciting to be here for this talk. So we're just going to open up, like Michael said, with some general questions from me. We'll do the 5 fast questions, and then it'll be up to you all. So hope you're thinking of some questions. But the first thing I wanted to ask you was, just on your journey to getting into the position that you are in, what has been a common theme for you? Do you have a mantra or a motto or something that's really been thematic over the course of your entire life and that has really helped you in your personal and professional career?
Yeah, great question. And by the way, thanks for having me here, especially for the inaugural kickoff of these. I'm super honored to be here, and definitely thanks for hosting this with me. One of the things that has been certainly common in my career is around leadership. So I did my undergrad at West Point, and I was commissioned into the United States Army as a commissioned officer. I was an aviation officer, so I flew helicopters, and talk about stories from there. But so I led, in the military, and when I got out to be a developer, and but just being an individual contributor doesn't mean you don't lead. And so I was leading as a software engineer, and eventually one of my bosses talked me into going into management. And from there, obviously, managers need to be able to lead, and that sort of started my career. And so leadership has been a big part of that, and one of the things that has really held fast for me is that if you have a set of principles by which you stand, you can fall back on them in tough times. One of the stories that I tell about that is, and that really was ingrained in me at West Point, and then just over the years really stuck with me. I have this sort of very sense of fairness, and that's really important to me as a principle. And I was at a company that was getting ready to do a big exit. It was a startup, they were exiting, and as part of the deal, they were closing down the stock option plan for the employees, but they weren't, in my opinion, doing it fairly. And we had a lot of conversations, and I was a key player in that. I was the CTO, I was taking over the presidency, so if I had stepped away, it would shut the deal down. And it kind of came to a point where I had to threaten to do that because I really felt they weren't treating the employees fair. And we finally came to a resolution. But in those tough times, like we had been working for years and years. This was like, the overnight success, I think it was like a 7-year startup. And they, this was a big deal for their investors and for the founders and stuff, but it had to be done the right way.
Right.
And so having a set of principles that you can fall back on, even in the hardest times, makes that, so that's one of my mantras.
Sweet.
Yeah.
And then, so how would you say those, that ethical leadership and those principles play into your current role at Etsy, like in the things you might do in terms of diversity or in terms of environmental impact of the company?
Yeah, that's a great point. And so at Etsy, we care about not only being a great company, but also doing great things, both for ourselves, as employees, but also our 2.6 million sellers that depend on us every day, and 40 million buyers, but also our community, the world at large. And so when we get to make decisions, I'll give you an example one, like we think about that from a perspective of how do we want to be treated, how do we want to be in our communities. A couple examples of that. One was, so we know that e-commerce causes a lot of carbon, right, to ship items, and we were contributing to that as a company because people ship items around the world as part of the Etsy marketplace. And so we really took a serious look at that and said, what can we do to offset that? And last year, we announced that we were offsetting all shipping, carbon offset for all of our shippers. And so we paid for that. And the crazy part of that story was, so we knew it was going to hurt our bottom line, at least we thought. So we went into that decision thinking this is not going to be as profitable for the company, but it's the right thing to do for our world. Turns out we put a banner up on the checkout that said, by the way, we're offsetting all the carbon of this. And it actually increased conversion so much that it paid for itself. So all of the e-commerce companies should take note that you can do good and be a good company. And so, yeah.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we'll transition into the quick fast 5 questions, like 30 seconds or less for the answers. You can do it, you can do it.
Tough.
All right, here we go. Question number 1. Okay, so what is a lesson that you've learned from a professor or a class at Crew?
Yeah, this will be really tough.
Okay.
So one of the things that I really took away from this was around my research. And as soon as you get someone talking about their research, this is my hack for students. If you want to get the professor off on a tangent, just ask them about the research. Because it's what they love to talk about, right? They've been doing this for years, so this might be a little more than 30 seconds. But in my research, I wanted to look at two-sided marketplaces and figure out, right, in two-sided marketplaces, are there any places that have two agents, right? It could be a buyer and seller. It could be social networks where somebody produces the content and someone consumes it. I've worked at several. PayPal was a two-sided marketplace. Etsy is, of course, a two-sided marketplace. And I want to look at why some of them succeeded and some of them didn't. As a technologist, I thought for sure there's a technology reason for this. But as we dug into this and we kept researching, we realized that the big sort of aha was that users misuse your product. And they misuse it in their trying to create their self-identity. And so this idea that customers really are going to misuse your product in ways that you can't possibly imagine really resonated with me and taught me about, right? Because in this world, as a technologist, we build products. And we think we know what the customers want. It reminds me of, if you ask the customers what they want, they say a horse, instead of a car, the famous quote. But we think we know what customers want. But in reality, they don't know it until it hits their hands. And so this idea that customers are going to misuse your product and you really need to test with them is super important. And so I've brought that out of case and put it to work. We published, myself and my co-researchers, we published a book about it. It's in other books about product development. And so it's gotten some traction, and I think it's really one of the most important things that I've learned here.
Awesome. Okay, great first question. Let's try for number 2. So how did Crew and your experience here prepare you for your career and entrepreneurial journey?
Yeah, I think what brought me back here was, so I was at undergrad computer science. While I was in the military, I did a master's in information systems. So I was very much a technologist. I started as a software developer at General Electric here. That's what brought me to Cleveland. But when I went into management, one of my mentors taught me that you can't speak to the other business partners in technical language. They don't understand it, and they're not, it's not going to convince them. And so I realized that I had no language to speak with them. And the language of business is finance. Even today, I sit on an executive team with 7 people, and I am the only technologist, right? That I can't come to that team and talk about that we're doing this cool tech because it doesn't resonate with them. I've got to bring it into business terms. And so that's what brought me back here to Case to learn the fundamentals in my MBA originally, to learn about finance and marketing and the fundamentals of business that I didn't have in my previous education.
Cool. Okay, question number 3. What's the most important trait to becoming an entrepreneur?
I think it's endurance.
Okay.
I hear some laughs. So I was with a couple early stage or startup companies, including starting my own consultancy, which I ran for 10 years. It's still running. It's been around for 15 years. And I call it the roller coaster. That Monday, it's amazing. We're going to rule the world. And Wednesday, everything, we're going to go out of business. Everything is horrible. And then Friday, it's all good again. And that is the emotional roller coaster that happens very often. As I mentioned, this overnight success sometimes takes 7 years. Often, I think that's the average. It's a slog. And so having that endurance is really important. And I think that's a key sort of characteristic.
It's a good characteristic. And I guess it applies to just life in general.
Totally, yeah.
Okay, so 4. What has been the most important takeaway from your biggest failure?
So another story. Sorry, I'm not keeping this to 30 seconds.
We love stories.
Okay, so when I was at PayPal, we had this big problem of scaling. And so PayPal at the time was growing so fast that we had someone keeping track of how long we had to live on our current hardware on a calendar. And we were down to weeks. And so we couldn't push new features without somehow taking something off because there were so many users on the site. And the reason for this is when PayPal first started, they were actually a Palm Pilot company. I don't know if anybody remembers Palm Pilot. It's probably some of the older. Yes. So they actually received their first funding by beaming money to each other across a Palm Pilot. And they realized quickly that there's not enough Palm Pilots in the world. We should really go to the web. So version 2 was web-based. But they never got over this idea that we're going to be face-to-face transferring money. Right? Nowadays, you never think about this person, when are they going to get my money on PayPal? But they never had this notion of a pending transaction, which we're all very familiar with in banking and so forth. You get a transaction, it's pending. PayPal didn't have that. If you don't have that, you can't store the user's data about their account in 2 different databases. Because you can't ever say, I take it from this account, and I'm pending it, and then I eventually put it over here, and when it reconciles, everything's good. It has to happen synchronously. And so we're on a single massive database. It was the largest database that in the world at the time. Oracle said it was the largest thing called SGA, which is a memory footprint. So we had all these plans to split it apart and fix it. And we worked for many, many weeks on this and rolled it out, and the site went down. And we ended up doing this thing called two-phase commit, which I highly recommend you never use. The site went down, and we struggled for a week to get the site back up. The site kept coming down, coming up and down, up and down, and that was a big failure. And so after that, we had to regroup, and we got back together, and I reestablished the vision that this is really important. We've got to do this for all the millions and millions of people that are counting on us to keep PayPal's site up. And what it taught me was that as leaders, you have got to get back up after failure, right? You can be sad for a moment, but get back up, dust yourself off, and lead. And that's really important, because you are going to have failures, right?
Had a lot already.
Yes, of course, yeah. And leaders lead, and they stand up and they get back. Yeah.
That was inspiring. For all of us that have had L's this week, it's been there. Okay, so last question. What has been your most entertaining, funny, interesting, quirky entrepreneurship story?
So maybe so when I went to PayPal, I had previously been in the military for 7 years, at GE for 7 years, in these very disciplined corporate environments. In fact, when I started at GE, I was wearing a coat and tie to work, even as a software developer. So I show up to PayPal, which was the exact opposite. I actually showed up at my interview in a suit, and they're like, at least take off the tie. They're gonna think you're an auditor. So I show up there, and they were tried to be acquired by eBay 6 times. And so they had this real animosity towards eBay. And when I showed up there, they had just been acquired by eBay. But what happened was eBay came in there and said, okay, we want to acquire you, you're worth $100 million. And PayPal said, no, we're worth $200 million. And they said, no way. And so 6 months later, they came back and said, okay, $200 million. And they said, now we're worth $400 million. And so this kid went back and forth. Meanwhile, they actually tried to kick PayPal off their site, eBay did. They bought a separate payments company and tried to put them in, and the users refused to use it and said, we've got to have PayPal. So really didn't like PayPal. So I show up from this corporate world where everything was very sort of rigorous and professional, and there's a picture of Meg Whitman, who was the CEO's or the eBay CEO, on a dartboard. And people were throwing darts at it. And shortly after I was there, a couple weeks into it, I hear this big sort of kerfuffle going on, and I walk over to it out of my cube, and I'm like, what's going on? They are literally having a boxing match in the office, in between cubes, for fun. Decide they're gonna have some fun that afternoon. And so that was like just such a different perspective and different world. So I went to 2 different extremes, but I ended up loving PayPal. I loved the people there and the work that we did. It was so much fun.
Awesome. Did you ever get to join in on any of the fights, or?
No, I avoided that.
Okay. Yeah. That's always good. So I guess now we'll open the floor up for larger questions. And when people do have questions, feel free to introduce yourself, your name, your major, your position, just so we have a better context for how to answer. And I guess we can poll the room really quickly before we get started. So how many undergraduate, graduate students are in here right now? Raise your loud and proud. Okay, awesome. How many faculty, staff of the university? Great, awesome. What are some other categories? Community
members.
Awesome, great.
Alumni. You could have several hands raised, correct?
Great, awesome.
Others, right. All right, so I've got the mic. Who would like to ask a question? Great. And this is Song said, please introduce it. David, you want them to turn towards the camera? You're good. Okay. All right. Sorry, streamers.
Yeah. Hi, Mike. I'm Santiago. I'm an electrical engineer that loves to code. So when you graduated from business school, Etsy didn't even exist. So I say this because the world moves so fast, especially the tech world. Do you have any advice how to keep up with it?
Yeah, I do think as a technologist, you always have to be in it. Even as a manager, you've got to keep your hands in the tech. I think there's a lot of reading we talked about. I'm a sort of voracious reader. I actually keep myself up to date with some of the technologies by playing around. I love to program. That's what I started. I still love that. So I keep side projects going on. Again, there's formal studies coming back to school, such as CASE or others. I think there's ways to do that. But I think a lot of self-study is really needed, and just keep playing around with technologies.
Thanks.
Hi, my name is Sahitya Wintrick. I'm a community member, would-be entrepreneur. You mentioned Etsy is a two-sided market. What, in your experience, would be the lessons learned from having a two-sided market? And how did Etsy solve that problem? Because, on the one hand, you don't have merchants. Without the merchants, you don't have users, and without users, you don't have merchants. So it's a similar problem I'm trying to solve. So
Yeah, that's a great point. So one of the really, really hard things about a two-sided marketplace and what makes it so valuable is that once it's established, it's really vibrant. But getting that is a super chicken and egg problem. You can't have if you don't have the suppliers, then you don't have the consumers, vice versa. I'll tell you that most two-sided marketplaces have some sort of origin story. I'll give you an example. Etsy just acquired a company called Reverb. If you're any musicians, all right, so Reverb resells musical instruments, new and used, but it's a marketplace for musical instruments, a lot of guitars and so forth. So they had the exact same problem. They were early stage startup, and how are they going to do this? And so they ended up buying from sellers pedals. So in electric guitars, they have these pedals that cause effects. And so they bought them and then would refurbish them and repackage them and resell them on the marketplace. But that was their enticement to get the sellers who had these pedals probably stuck under their bed or whatever, and they wanted to get them into the marketplace and get sellers. And then once they're there, the sellers, especially in musical instruments, often they're the ones who then buy. And so that's what they did, is they put a little bit of sort of kindling on that marketplace to get it going. And I often find there's many stories like that. At least the sort of what they say about YouTube. Again, not sure if it's true, but how it really got its sort of spark was somebody ended up putting some copyrighted material up there. It was too small at the time for anybody to notice, but it got users to come there, and that's what sort of kindled that. Obviously, they don't do that anymore, but so I think around all two-sided marketplaces, there is this origin story. eBay, I don't know if you know, but like what everyone thinks is their sort of origin story is the Pez dispenser. So what they got a ton of press with was that, oh, it's a site that it's so cute, they sold Pez dispensers, and that was their first transaction. That was big, a lot of press that got the story. I think the first actual item they sold was like a broken laser pointer or something. That wasn't going to get the press, and so they had some kindle, I don't know who, some reporter or who started that story, but that was something that gave that sort of two-sided marketplace a little bit of kindling to get started. So I think that's what you've got to figure out when you start this, is how do you jumpstart that? Because it's really hard. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Jack. I'm a marketing and accounting double major undergrad. So I got two quick questions. One, you said you're a voracious reader. What are some books you might recommend for someone interested in management, especially in tech companies? And two, what are some lessons you've taken from the military into your everyday work?
Cool. So some of the books that I would recommend, especially as like a tech manager or engineering management by Camille Fournier. She also just wrote a book I contributed a couple chapters to called 97 Things Every Engineering Manager Should Know. I think that's got, and it's not because my chapter's in there. It's got a dozen other people that I really admire in the tech community, providing some advice in there. I think Ben Horowitz, The Hard Thing About Hard Things, Eric Ries's Lean Startup. I think all of those are great books. I think anything by the Heath brothers, Made to Stick, Switch, and a couple other books. I think all of those are really great books. And then I think from the military, I think a lot of things around leadership. The military taught me not only like how to lead, but probably more importantly, how to develop leaders. The military has, as you would expect, after 200 years, like they've got this down, and they go through this process where they screen people, right? You've got to have some basic characteristics, but it's really broad. It is not super narrow as you would expect. It's not like, oh, we only want that super charismatic leader. It's not that at all. It's very broad, just some basic characteristics. And then they take you through a little bit of classroom training, right? And you do some sort of open discussions and you read some literature about it. But the big thing is they get you leading. And they get you leading with a mentor. And this is what's the big takeaway here is mentorship is so important in becoming a leader. And I've had the fortune of having some great great mentors, both in the military. I mentioned the person that got me into management. She was my sort of first engineering management mentor. She got me back into the MBA program, taught me so much about the basics of engineering management. And I think that's the big thing is to develop as a leader, you need to find a mentor, and then once you're in that position, mentor other people.
I think we have a Facebook question from Doug.
So Jennifer Rossi said, you mentioned being an entrepreneur as a roller coaster, struggling with failures and having to still lead regardless of what's going on. How do you coach and find the right words for your team through those rough times when maybe even you yourself want to throw your hands up and give up?
Yeah. Admittedly, I think it's very tough. Right? That's the tough thing about entrepreneurship is sticking that out through the really hard times because you know there are going to be. And I think you've got to fall back on your ultimate mission or something inspiring. As I mentioned about with when I came in to PayPal, they had just been acquired by eBay. All of their leaders, right? You probably heard about like the PayPal Mafia, that like group of leaders. They were walking out the door. I literally would run into them on we used to have a beer party Friday nights up on the roof, and they would be coming in. That was their sort of final farewell, right as I was stepping in. And so there's this very young, the engineering team was only about 30 people at the time, very, very young engineers who were really demoralized. They had just been acquired by kind of an arch nemesis. They were, their leaders their leaders had literally said, come follow me and you can change the world. We're going to go up against the biggest banks in the world and win. And they did. And then they were leaving. And so they were really demoralized about this. And so I knew I had to find something that rallying cry. And the scale problem was the rallying cry. That we made it urgent that we fix this problem. And it gave a purpose for everybody to focus on. And like I mentioned, we had people literally keeping countdowns of the days until the site would fall over. But doing that got them inspired again. And I think going back to that sort of vision that you can get excited about and your team can get excited about, I think you've got to find that. I think that's the key there.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Batul.
Hey, thanks for that. It's been great. I'm Batula Zaidi. I'm the CEO of Science First Partnerships. I also got my PhD from here at Case in bioinformatics. So sometimes the simplest questions are the most important and difficult to answer. We've started interacting with the Boys and Girls Club and the public at large more. How do you define tech? It's technology. So within the industry, right? But then to people at the public at large.
Yeah. I think it's evolving. It used to be you're only high tech if you were kind of online. I think the reality is every company is a tech company now. And I think that's going to be, the world. That's why we have such a demand, and we have, almost zero unemployment for many of the engineering disciplines. Certainly in the software world, that there's almost no unemployment because there's such a demand for it. So I think I would define it very, very broadly, and I think almost every company is a tech company, and even companies that that deal with such physical properties like retail space and so forth are becoming tech companies. So I don't know if that exactly answered, but I think it's super broad. I think almost every company nowadays can't afford not to be a tech company. Yeah.
Hi, Mike. I'm Antonio. I'm a biomedical engineering undergrad with a strong interest in management. I also have 2 questions for you today. The first is that since you came here to get your MBA, but you're in a more engineering management role and you see a lot of engineering management employees, what do you recommend in terms of grad school, like MBA versus engineering management, and if you think there's a difference? Second question is, you mentioned that obviously you're very busy as a CTO, a lot of a more managerial role, but you do have a lot of CS projects on the side. Any tips for managing those managing that time, I guess?
Yeah. I think on the first question, I don't have a strong opinion about engineering management masters or an MBA. I think what's really important is that you get the knowledge that you need. And so as you become, and I would actually argue you should stay within your technology space and get pretty deep before you go into management. I find the absolute best managers have a background in their tech, whatever it is, for a number of years. I would say on average it's probably 5 to 7. It could be many, many more, or occasionally fewer. But having that solid background of your discipline allows you to have confidence, allows you to speak with authority. A lot of times you're not going to know, but if you have the confidence that, like, I know this space, right? This is where I came up from. I know this discipline. I can ask a lot of other questions and feel confident that people respect me for my opinion and so forth. So first, I wouldn't jump super straight into that. The other is then, as you're going through that, figure out what you want to be. What piece of knowledge are you missing? As I mentioned, I had, just because my undergrad was at the military academy, we didn't have business courses, right? All of our sort of, courses were taken up with, besides your major, was military courses, military art, history and leadership, so forth. And so I didn't have that as my undergrad. And so I needed that personally. And so I think that's my advice, is figure out what exactly you need, and then figure out, do you need it through a certain program, and which program provides that? That's the best advice. Yeah.
Hi, Mike. My name is Ronak, and I'm a second-year undergraduate in computer science. You spoke about how ethical leadership is important to you, and a lot of times, based on my experience working with an early-stage startup, I found that in the interest of achieving a very, very high growth rate, you sometimes have to end up sacrificing sort of healthy work practices. How would you suggest sort of negotiating that boundary in an early-stage startup?
Yeah. I think it's very, very tough. We were talking with a group before this that, so another story from sort of the PayPal time. When I first joined, I think we were pushing out version 9 of the site, and I'd only been there a couple weeks. They'd been working for many, many weeks on this. And I remember showing up, it was a Thursday morning, and I showed up to work, and I'm like, oh, I think I'll stay. We're going to do the push at 11 p.m. Pacific time. And I went around to the engineering managers, and I said, anything really risky in this? Nope. This is really, really simple, straightforward. I didn't leave the office until Sunday from that release. So as soon as they pushed it, users started coming on the site went down, couldn't keep it back, couldn't get the site back up. We struggled for days trying to get that back up. It turned out, if for any of the tech in the room are interested, that we're actually changing out an SSL library. So at PayPal, between every single tier is a 3-tiered architecture. We encrypted the data. So you couldn't be like a man-in-the-middle attack. So someone got in the network, they couldn't see the traffic in between our servers. So it went from the web server, the app server, the database. Anyway, we encrypted it all. We swapped out the library, left the encryption too high, tanked it. So it took days to figure that out. But there was no work-life balance. It was work to get that. And I think that's what I think, at least for me and many of the startups or this world, is like, when there's work, I do the work, and then try to find other periods of time, which is downtime, to take people. And I think still today, when people are on call and so forth, luckily Etsy is very available, and we don't have that sort of issue. But even with people on call, that's burdensome to their personal life. And so we really try to take care of the people, make sure they have time off afterwards and so forth. I think the startup is just that cycle of, it's not going to be a balance. It's more like that roller coaster, and that's what you have to go in, I think, expecting it.
Get my steps in.
Hi there, Mike. I'm Mary Beth. I'm a recent MBA graduate here at Weatherhead, and have long been following Etsy. Really love the work that you do. And I remember reading an article once that said a really good therapist, Match.com and Etsy all have the same problem. Your best and most successful clients leave you. So I just wanted to hear how you guys think about that, either from a technology standpoint or strategy. As you see, really from the merchant level, they gain traction and maybe get more of a retail presence. They're leaving the site. because of those darn pesky fees. So what do you see if you, again, and kind of thinking about a launch pad of any accelerator model, as those companies are gaining success and traction, where do you see that continuity and how do you plan for that?
And Etsy is known as the sort of incubator for the makers of the world because, as we call it, it's 20 cents in a dream. So there's 20-cent listing fee, and you can place your items for sale. And what we found is that the really successful who do what we call multi-channel is they don't leave Etsy necessarily. It's one of their many channels. Oftentimes, if it's still online, we're still their biggest channel. But they spread out. They don't want to be dependent on a single marketplace because marketplaces ebb and flow, and so they often go out and they build their own site or they go to other marketplaces and try that mix. And then the really, really big ones do go into retail space, and then they have to focus primarily on shipping that. But generally, the biggest don't leave. They keep us open as a channel. But I think there's always the possibility that they do, and we look at it and we say the fees that we charge, we've got to provide services for them that they can't get anywhere else or do themselves cheaper or better or more efficiently. And so one example of that is like in advertisements. We can leverage our accounts and campaigns at like Google's, Facebook, all these places we can advertise and get way more efficiency than they can as individuals. So if they win as an individual, they've got a really small spend, and we can aggregate all that up, and so we have a bigger spend, and so we do that. We do that on shipping fees, so we provide discounts. So that's the ways that we try to keep them, until they're big enough to like negotiate themselves, we try to keep that so we're providing those economies of scale and pass them along. Yeah.
Great, Doug, did you want to, from the chat?
Yeah. So Sean Coleman asked, when marketing two-sided marketplaces, do you think it's best to keep the messaging separate and specific to each side, or to have a singular message that weaves in the benefits to both sides, and why?
I think it depends. It depends on the marketplace. We were talking about Reverb, for example, and it turns out that many of their sellers are also buyers. So if you are a professional musician, and I'm not, but apparently you like to change out your instruments, especially like guitarists and people. And so they realized that essentially the message was the same for those. So once you got a seller, you would get the buyers and so forth. Etsy, not necessarily, right? We have 2.6 million makers, but we have 40 million buyers, so the scale has to be much larger. And so we generally keep those marketing messages separately or separate. It does blend a bit. Obviously, most of our sellers are buyers on there, and we do stuff like television campaigns. Even though it's geared towards buyers, it's also inspiring for someone to say, "Oh yeah, I could sell on Etsy." And so it's a little bit of that blend, even though we primarily focus a lot of that, television and stuff like that, on buyers. So, but I think the answer is it depends on the marketplace. Are they generally two separate populations, or do they overlap almost 100% in some cases?
Hi, I'm Pratik. I'm a computer science and finance double major here at Case. So my question to you is that you've worked at both the smaller startup-like company as well as Etsy, of course. How does the role as a CTO vary from a smaller environment to something more established like Etsy?
Yeah, good question. So, the smaller environment, you might be a CTO of yourself, right? You might be the co-founder and CTO. In that case, you are doing the work. And even when you're getting the bigger, companies often CTOs are still either developing hands-on keyboard or at least architecting and designing a lot until you hit 50 sort of person range. Someone just recently said that the higher you go, the more HR becomes your job, and I would agree with that. That primarily, the bigger your organization, you're focused more on people than you are on tech. And in my world, so Etsy's about 1,000 employees. Half of them are engineers, so about 500 are in my org. And I love to code and to architect and design, but my engineers are way better than I am at that. They've done it professionally for years. I've got a chief architect, and he's got architects, and they're way better at that than I am. And so my job is much more on the people and organization side of things. And so that's what changes as you grow.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Then I'll come back to you.
Hi, Mike. My name is Alvin. I work here at a pharmaceutical startup company here in Cleveland. And I just want to thank you because on behalf of my sister lives in Santa Cruz, and she works at Google initially. And then she was able to draw her interest in artistry, and she ended up having a retail space in Santa Cruz. So yes, that that is the initial goal, is to have a little side hobby that propels it to be moving into something bigger. I wanted to ask you in terms of the security, because I know that a lot of things happening with Airbnb and even same with RV shares, where people utilize your sort of two-peer space as a sort of a money laundering scheme or scam. How do you prevent that from happening at Etsy?
Yeah, good question. And you're right that marketplaces are really susceptible to that. In fact, again, the PayPal story. So before I got there, but the PayPal had the Russian mafia trying to launder money, and they were so worried about it at one point they had physical security protecting them as they were trying to get them off the site. But all marketplaces, I think, eBay had some news about this many years ago. I think everybody's susceptible to this. We take it very seriously. There's many security precautions we could put in place to validate sellers as they're onboarded. We also have pretty sophisticated machine learning models that look for this and look for fraud and type of money laundering and anything like that. We look for automated account takeovers and stuff like that. So a lot of that is automated because the volume that we deal with, right? We have 60 million listings. And so you can imagine that thousands and tens of thousands of shops and listings that get put on each day. And so we have to have a ton of automation. But we also have a team of specialists that's trust and safety, and that's their job, is to vet. So the automation can handle a bunch of it, but we still have a team of humans that go in and validate that to make sure that the models are correct, or that they're, because this is an arms race with, unfortunately, with criminals, that the better we get, the better they get. And the better, and it literally goes back and forth. Every time we block something, they try to figure out a way around it. But we have people and automation all the way to the most sophisticated machine learning models in place to do that.
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Mike. Chris Diaz. I'm a alumnus of a KSEE major, and I work here at Nottinghamsburg in Cleveland. You mentioned earlier in your talk about people who will misuse your products, and that there were articles or books or things that you had written. I was curious to find out where to find those articles or books or things of people misusing stuff and not understanding how products supposed to be used.
Yeah, totally. And one example of that is, and I mentioned people do it in most of the times because they want to express their self-identity in some particular way. So we ended up writing a book called The Power of Customer Misbehavior. And one of the stories that we tell in the book is about Facebook in its early days. And anybody remember Friendster? Yeah. Oh, yeah. All right. It had a short life. And so people, of course, part of their self-identity is pets. Right? We all love our pets. And so people wanted social identities or accounts for their pets. So they wanted a Facebook page and a Friendster page. And Friendster called them, they literally, in the research, we got a quote from someone who worked there that said they called them fakesters. And they shut down all the fake pet accounts. And Facebook was like, oh, sounds like a good idea. And they let a third-party developer create dog book and cat book. I forget how many millions of dogs are on dog book at this point. I think it eventually got wrapped into the application itself. But that was an example of nobody thought about oh, I'm going to start a social network that eventually dogs and cats are going to be on because they need besties too. But that's what people wanted, and you've got to be open to that. As long as it's not, sort of criminal or, or against your principles or something. You got to be a little bit willing to let the community decide what they want to use this for. So yeah, that's yeah.
Hi, my name is Emberlyn. I'm studying product design and graphic design emphasis at Cleveland Institute of Art, and my question is. how valued or important are artists in the tech industry, and do you have any advice to give an artist going into the tech industry?
Yeah. I know at Etsy it's incredibly valuable. So the way we're divided up is into product teams. So about half of the engineers are product engineers, about half support like infrastructure, stuff like that. On the product teams, they're broken down into 35 separate squads. And all the squads are comprised of engineers, an engineering manager, a product manager, a designer, and an analyst. And so we have them embedded on every single squad because it's so important. And so people who have this, artist design background, it's super important. And we take it really seriously. Everything that we do kind of goes through, that group. And they work together sort of centrally, but they also work distributed on all the teams. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Brandon Rudolph. I'm studying data science. And from what I can tell, data science means different things to different companies. Yeah. As a CTO of a company that has millions of users and has millions of transactions each day, how does your company implement the tools of data science?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I've been at Etsy about 2.5 years now, a little over that. And over the last 2 years, we've done two big things. One is we migrated out of our data centers onto Google Cloud. And so that was a big initiative. The other was taking data science and embedding it as much as we can into the product. And the very first thing we did was on search. And so the basic way search works is, if you're familiar with the technology, you've got this big index. When you write a search query, you type in, wool blanket, it goes and picks up all the relevant listings that have that in either their titles or their tags or a description or something, and it brings it back. But that list could be huge. It could be 10,000 items, especially on Etsy, which has 60 million items. And so we knew that we need to re-rank that. And so we put the data scientists or machine learning engineers onto that problem, and they took the top 400, eventually it became 400 items that were returned, and they re-ranked it in real time based on a machine learning model. And we ended up calling this context-specific ranking. So we based it on the context that you were searching from, your search history and other people's search history that was similar to it, and what other people had clicked on when they did that same query and so forth. And we had all these features that we included in the model. I think it was like 25 different features. And that re-ranking and many iterations of it over 2 years generated $260 million in incremental sales for our sellers. So it was huge. And when we realized the sort of power that machine learning, we've been ramping that up ever since. And it's recommendations, ranking, all of this has been a big focus of ours. So yeah, it's a huge initiative for us, absolutely. Yeah.
Hi, Mike. Thanks for coming. I'm curious how maybe you or... Oh, sorry, I'm Ben. I'm a member of the community. I'm curious how you or Etsy as an organization determines when and if to make changes to your operations when there's new technology. So you've got a two-sided marketplace, for example. Out comes the iPhone. Should we respond to that? Out comes a blockchain or a quantum computer.
Yeah. So I think some of the history of Etsy is that, so Etsy started about almost 15 years ago now, and they were early innovators in a lot of stuff in the tech space. They were known very, very early for continuous deployment. So we actually, developers can push code straight from their development environment into production in about 20, 30 minutes. And they do it all day. We push 20, 30 times a day sometimes. And super early innovators in that, very early innovators in like monitor everything. So like monitor, we collect over 1 billion events a day off the marketplace and like data, and we monitor that to make sure it's performing well. So anyway, they're early innovators, but one of the drawbacks of that is that they never looked back and said, oh, there's whole industries around this now. So there are whole industries around monitoring, right? There's a dozen companies that help do this now. The data center was another. So the site was running in a data center on bare metal. We're happy with it. It was running. all of a sudden you've got virtualization with hypervisors and eventually now containers and stuff. And so they really never looked at that. And so they didn't keep up with it. And I think that was one of the things that when I got asked, I first came in as a consultant, and that's what the CEO asked me to look at is like, should they be modernizing more of this? And my take on it was yes. I felt we needed to modernize. And so we've been on a journey to do that and to leverage more of the newer technologies. I think there's certainly cases when old and boring technology is very useful and it's not worth, but there's a lot of cases when, we call it kind of moving up the stack. If we can get out of this hosting, then our engineers can work closer to the customer and be building products or stuff that help the customers more than, our sellers don't care that we're the world's best at hosting a server, right? They really care that we are the world's best at like searching or for their items or that we're doing great recommendations. And so that's the lens that we look through stuff in. And we look through, whether it's blockchain or quantum computing or whatever else, like we look at it and say, is it applicable for us that our sellers would really care about it or gives us a competitive advantage? And I think that's the way to look at things.
You bid that through your personal consultancy?
What's that?
You bid that through your consultancy?
Was I?
Originally?
Originally?
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's how my sort of history of Etsy was. I ran a consultancy for about 10 years. One of the clients that I met was Etsy. So I met them when they were a startup. They were having the scale problems. And I worked with them on a couple other projects. And then that's how I got back into Etsy in 2017. The CEO asked me to come in and do some analysis for him. And kind of one thing led to another and said, would you stay? And I've always loved the mission of Etsy. Like, I love that they're helping these creative entrepreneurs. I love entrepreneurs, by the way. So like, it's, this is the backbone of our economy. It creates the most jobs, and so I love being part of a company that supports creative entrepreneurs. And I've always thought the engineering team was super strong. And I think one of the examples of that is finishing this migration to the cloud in 2 years. It's kind of crazy. They had the marketplace running on the cloud within like 6 months. So fast. They are such good engineers. So I love that. I love the culture. They've got such a diverse and inclusive culture. And so I didn't think I was going to go back operationally. I was consulting. I was doing some teaching here. I loved it. But there's a big draw for me for Etsy and the mission and the culture. Yeah.
Did you have a question? Yeah. Okay, great.
So my name is Rashik. I'm a sophomore here at Case studying computer science. So my question was, what was the most difficult part of your transition from a software developer into a more management role?
I think one of the challenges, the generic challenge is that as a software developer, you get almost instant gratification, right? Yeah. You write your code, it works, something's on the screen, you can see it. As a manager, dealing with people, that gratification gets much, much longer. As a line manager, a lot of times you're working with someone to develop some skill that they need, and you've got to watch that develop over time, so that goes longer. Like in my roles, I look at changes over years, so the gratification for this stuff gets really long. I think that's one of the big changes. The other challenge is if you really love programming, stepping away from that. And I see managers have a challenge with that all the time, new managers, because they go into management, because they want to try leading or managing teams, but they just miss programming. It's a part of a lot of us. Like, it's that, it's what we love to do. It's why we got into it in the first place.
I'll do my colleague Joe Jankowski as the last question asker, and we'll wrap up the formal part of this. Very good.
Thanks again for coming. So speaking of the mission, and you help artists, and you also said there are values that are important to Etsy. Does the CTO and does automation come into play in trying to, police is a bad word, but in making sure that the artists and what they're representing, because art at times has the willingness or intent to shock, of making sure that the products and services sold on Etsy match values so that you are not getting things that are profane or exclusionary? How does an organization that playing on the CTO, if at all?
Yeah, we do. We have a team that works, I mentioned trust and safety. We also have a member services team, and both of those work on the marketplace and the community. We have a pretty strong community of sellers that will report what they see on there, and so they help police. And so I think between all three of those groups, they're very active in pulling stuff down, and we build the tools that support that. So we build tools for, like, unfortunately, I don't know if you've heard news like baby yoga has been in the news and how they didn't want that up. And so we help build tools to do kind of these mass takedowns when necessary. But they're heavily involved with people. The member services team, the trust and safety team are heavily involved to make sure we're doing that in a manner that's right for the community. So I think it's that. We do, like, our mission is to keep commerce human. It is ultimately the marketplace is there to connect one buyer and one seller, to connect two humans to do a transaction. And we see the automation as not taking people out of it. And even with things like trust and safety and member services and all this, that, like, we want to automate them and help them to be more efficient, but we don't want to take the human out of it. As much as possible, when you call, we want someone to actually answer or respond on chat or something like that, because it's important. It's part of our mission, and we try to have the mission resonate within as well as out.
Very good. Well, that was a fast hour. Thank you so much. What a great way to start this series. What I didn't even mention before is this literally started, Mike and I were going to have lunch today. He didn't know I invited, 100 people and whoever else online. I was like, oh, we should catch up for lunch. It's like, oh, by the way. So thank you for your willingness. I owe you a lunch. Probably this is more interesting anyway than just catching up with me. So thank you very much. And Song, thank you so much for moderating. So let's thank them. So we're going to continue this, and we're excited about it. Our next speaker is Veale Tecco, who started Rock Health and has a new startup in the fertility space. That'll be via Zoom, but we'll do it here in person at ThinkBox on the 6th floor. For students, you can see we don't have the Song version here. Our format is going to be kind of in conversation with students, so students who are interested in moderating a session. The other thing is, and for alums who may be watching on Facebook, like, we're looking for more alums. We're looking for a broad section of alums and diverse backgrounds across our schools. So feel free to ping us on Facebook or email me or tweet at me over the many ways we can be reached and suggest alums in our network. And we're going to be doing a lot of stuff up here on floor 6. For those watching on Facebook that don't live in Cleveland, haven't been to ThinkBox, please come and join us and come back to campus. And this is really a great space for the community to get together. One last thing I'll mention, we do have a few mentors from our Burton D. Morgan mentoring program. I know Hal is here, and Dale is here, and a few others are here as well. We had some signings. Any students or entrepreneurs that want to sort of brainstorm with folks in our mentoring network, Doug is in the back. Just sort of grab him, where we can also buttonhole people sort of informally. And that will do it for our program today. Have a wonderful rest of your day and a great weekend. And again, thank you for those who joined via streaming.